In 1931, a fisherman named Pilgrim Lockwood was hauling in his nets 25 miles off the Norfolk coast when something snagged them. He leaned over the rail of the Calinda and pulled it free. It was a harpoon, carved from bone, ancient, and absolutely perfect. He turned it over in his hands for a long time, because there is only one possible explanation for how a prehistoric weapon ends up on the floor of the open sea. The sea floor was once dry land, and that land was once home to thousands of people. The sea had been keeping it for them ever since. Beneath the North Sea, beneath the shipping lanes and the wind farms and the trawler routes that modern Britain depends on, there is a drowned world. Archaeologists call it Doggerland. It was a country, a vast, fertile landscape of river valleys, ancient marshlands, and dense forest that stretched all the way from the east coast of Britain to what is now Denmark, Germany, and the Netherlands. At its peak, it was home to thousands of Mesolithic people, hunter-gatherers who fished its rivers, hunted its forests, raised families, and built lives in a landscape that no longer exists. For almost 10,000 years, Britain was not an island. It was the western edge of a continuous European world. The people of prehistoric Britain could walk to France. They could walk to Denmark. Doggerland was not the edge of their world. It was the center of it. And then the sea swallowed it whole. This is the story of what was lost, and of the woman whose bones the sea has been holding for 8,000 years. 20,000 years ago, the world looked nothing like it does today. The last great ice age still held the northern hemisphere in its grip. Vast sheets of ice, kilometers thick, covered Scotland and Scandinavia. And because so much of the planet's water was locked inside those glaciers, sea levels were almost 130 meters lower than they are now. The land that would become Doggerland was high and dry. And as the ice age slowly ended, as those glaciers retreated north over thousands of years, the melting revealed something remarkable, a landscape of almost unimaginable richness. Stand in Doggerland. 12,000 years ago, on a morning in early autumn. The grass is long and wet with dew. Behind you, a river, wide and slow and copper-brown with sediment, so broad you could not shout across it. Beyond the river, forest, oak and elm so dense and old that the canopy kills the light 20 feet from the tree line, and the undergrowth beneath them is a permanent twilight. Ahead of you, marshland, reed beds stretching to the horizon, alive with noise, geese, thousands of them, filling the sky in a long gray ribbon, the smell of cold mud and still water, and somewhere you cannot see, wood smoke. Something is moving in the reeds. Underfoot, the ground is soft, uncertain, the kind of land that holds your footprints long after you have moved on. You are standing in the heartland of prehistoric Europe, and in 8,000 years, every inch of this will be gone. We know them as the Doggerlanders, Mesolithic hunter-gatherers who moved with the seasons, following the great deer herds south in winter, returning to the coastal fishing grounds when the weather turned. They left no monuments, no writing, no cities, but they left their tools, thousands of them. And the sea has been returning them ever since. Fishermen dragging their nets across the North Sea floor have brought up stone blades and flint arrowheads, antler picks and carved bone, mammoth skulls, and the leg bones of aurochs. Fragments of a world scattered across the seabed, like the contents of an upturned drawer. In recent years, researchers from the University of Bradford, led by archaeologist Professor Vince Gaffney, have used seismic survey data from North Sea oil companies to map over 180,000 square kilometers of the submerged landscape. They have traced ancient river courses, sand dune ridges, lake beds, the ghosts of a coastline that vanished 8,000 years ago. Gaffney's conclusion, after a career spent studying this place, is precise and devastating. Doggerland was not a land bridge. It was not merely a corridor between Britain and Europe. It was the heartland. The place where culture formed, where communities met and traded, where generations lived and died without ever imagining it might one day be gone. Let me tell you about a woman. We do not know her name. We do not know what she looked like, or how old she was, or whether she had children. We do not know what she believed, or what language she spoke, or what she was doing in the hours before she died. We know one thing. She lived in Doggerland, and when she died, the land held her. For 8,000 years, the North Sea held her too. In the early 20th century, a fishing net brought up a fragment of her skull from the seabed. It was catalogued, studied, and eventually dated. She lived sometime in the Mesolithic, somewhere between 10,000 and 7,000 years ago. She is the closest thing we have to a face for this lost world. A single human life, recovered from the deep. She was not alone, of course. The Doggerlanders were sophisticated, adaptable people. Their flint tools were finely worked. Knives, scrapers, arrowheads, harpoon points, not unlike the one Pilgrim Lockwood pulled from his net in 1931. They built canoes from hollowed timber and navigated river systems hundreds of miles long. They fished with nets and bone hooks. They made ornaments from amber and perforated shells. They buried their dead with care. We know from footprints preserved on the Scottish coast, the same era, the same world, that they moved in family groups. Adults and children, crossing mudflats at low tide together. A snapshot of an ordinary afternoon, preserved by extraordinary chance. And they were not isolated. The seismic data shows that Doggerland's rivers acted as highways, connecting communities across the entire region. Ideas and materials and people moved freely across this landscape in ways that became impossible once the sea divided Britain from the continent. The woman whose skull we found had trade goods within reach. She had community. She had a home. She had a world. By around 10,000 years ago, Doggerland was at the height of its extent, a country roughly the size of Britain itself. Forests and rivers and marshland stretching from horizon to horizon. But the ice was still melting, and the sea was still rising. The drowning of Doggerland did not happen overnight. It was a process measured in centuries, almost imperceptibly slow on the scale of a single human life, yet catastrophically fast on any geological measure. At its peak rate, sea levels were rising by as much as 2 meters every 100 years. 2 meters per century does not sound like much. But consider what that meant for the people living here. Within a single generation, within the span of one person's memory, the fishing grounds their parents had known would be swallowed. The coastline they walked as children would vanish beneath the tide. The rivers their grandparents had named would widen into estuaries, then inlets, then open water. Doggerland did not flood. It fragmented. The great central plains went first, drowning slowly, year by year, until the higher ground broke clear as a scattered archipelago of islands. The rivers became straits. The marshes became shallow seas. The people retreated, generation by generation, northward into what would become Scotland, westward into Britain, eastward into what would become the Netherlands and Denmark. They carried their tools and their knowledge and their stories with them. And the sea kept coming. By around 8,000 years ago, Doggerland was reduced to a low chain of islands in the middle of what was rapidly becoming the North Sea. The highest ground, the plateau we now call the Dogger Bank, still sat 3 meters above sea level. People still lived there. We know this because they left their bones. We know this because of her. Around 8,200 years ago, on an ordinary morning, in a world that had no warning and no word for what was coming, the North Sea changed forever. Off the coast of Norway, deep beneath the surface, the edge of the continental shelf had been quietly failing for centuries. Thousands of years of glacial debris, piled on an unstable seabed, had finally reached its limit. Without warning, an area of seabed, the size of Scotland, 80,000 square kilometers, collapsed into the ocean floor. It was one of the largest underwater landslides in human history. The water above it did not simply fall, it displaced 3,500 cubic kilometers of sediment moving at once. The resulting wave was not a single wall of water. It was a series of them, radiating outward across the North Sea in every direction at the speed of a jet aircraft. When it reached the coast of eastern Scotland, the water stood between 10 and 20 meters high. Trees were torn from the ground, settlements destroyed in minutes. When it reached the last inhabited islands of Doggerland, the low, sandy ridges where the final communities had retreated as the sea rose around them, it swept across them completely. The people on those islands would have had no warning. We think of the woman whose skull we found, and we wonder, was she there when it came? Was she somewhere safe, already carried westward by the slow migration of generations? We will never know. What we know is that her world ended. The Storegga tsunami did not drown Doggerland alone. The sea had been rising for thousands of years before it, and continued rising for thousands after. But the wave almost certainly destroyed whatever remained of the inhabited islands. The Dogger Bank itself was finally swallowed by the sea a few centuries later. And after that, silence. Britain was an island. Doggerland was gone. For 8,000 years, it was forgotten. Professor Gaffney, who has spent his career mapping this drowned country, uses a phrase that stops you cold. He says that exploring Doggerland is like discovering a country the size of England and Scotland combined. A country that no living human has ever set foot on, that has no name on any modern map, whose people left no legends, no monuments, no written words. What we have lost is not just land. We have lost an entire chapter of human history. The chapter that explains how Britain was first settled, how prehistoric Europeans traded and communicated across a landscape that no longer exists, how our ancestors adapted to one of the most dramatic climate events in the history of human civilization. Every time a fisherman dredges up a fragment of antler or flint from the North Sea floor, they are recovering one sentence of that lost chapter. The sea has held these objects in silt and cold and darkness for longer than agriculture has existed, longer than the pyramids. It has been keeping them for us. Today, the engineers laying cables and turbine foundations on the North Sea bed have become, almost by accident, the most active prehistoric archaeologists in Britain. The same infrastructure projects that are building the energy future of this island are also, incidentally, returning fragments of its oldest past. There is a shallow plateau in the middle of the North Sea called the Dogger Bank. Fishermen have worked it for centuries. It is extraordinarily rich in cod and haddock, because the shallow, cold, nutrient-dense water above it is among the most productive fishing grounds in Europe. On old Dutch charts, it is marked precisely. A vast underwater plain, sitting 30 meters below the surface. What those charts do not say is that the Dogger Bank is the last surviving high ground of a drowned country. That the sands beneath those trawler nets were once hills. That 8,000 years ago, people walked across them and looked out at the rising sea. That she may have walked across them. We do not know what they called this place. We do not know what language they spoke, what songs they sang at the edge of the water, what stories they told their children about the land disappearing behind them. But they were here. And the sea is still returning their bones. Around 360 BC, Plato wrote about a great civilization, powerful, sophisticated, connected to the world, that was swallowed by the sea in a single catastrophic event. He called it Atlantis. For centuries, scholars have searched the Mediterranean, the Atlantic, the Caribbean. They have found nothing definitive. But here in the North Sea is a real civilization that was genuinely swallowed by the sea. A real landmass, larger than Britain, that genuinely connected a great culture to the rest of the world. A real people, with real lives, who watched their world disappear beneath the water over generations. and then, in one terrible morning. We may never know whether Plato had heard some ancient whisper of Doggerland's drowning, whether the survivors carried that memory westward into Britain, passed it down through hundreds of generations, until it reached Greece as a legend. But I think it is worth asking,